never slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up. I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up and make a statement. I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up and make a statement.
Hi, this is Rick, and this is Burn After Reading. I must admit, I am very relieved to be near the finish line of my West Memphis 3 series. You know, since the middle of January, I have created 8 episodes, including this one, and I don't think there's anything else that needs to be said unless another popular misconception about this case makes waves and needs addressed. You know, one of the hopes I had for this series was for it to be a gateway to more in-depth information. Be it someone visiting the Callahan website to read all the available documents of this case, or to listen to other podcasters who go into it far more than myself. I would never claim to be an expert, but I think I know a thing or two regarding this case. One of my other goals was to just break it down into categories, give an introduction, discuss the convicted child killers individually, and address the media phenomenon. I never wanted to preach to the choir. I mean, what's the point in doing that, right? I mean, don't get me wrong. I am so thankful for the support I have received by so many like-minded people. But this series was for the ones who didn't know that they were being cleverly misled. Perhaps my sense of humor, language, and unfiltered personality isn't for everyone, but I hope the information I shared I hope it was enough to enlighten someone out there. After this review, I will briefly discuss Damien's court hearing from June 23rd and the events around it, and I will also address a few things Bob said in his podcast on July 1st. With that said, let's get on with it. Episode 2 starts with theories. Bob tells us that he truly believes this case is solvable, and it comes with a lot of pressure because he's given hope to some of the West Memphis 3 and the victims' families. He just wants justice for Stevie, Michael, and Christopher. He believes the killer is still out there and could kill again, or maybe has already done so. He goes on about how prosecuting attorney Scott Ellington made a promise that if any new evidence comes to light, that he would consider looking into it. He then confuses new evidence with new technology, and of course that's referring to MVAC. He sets the tone that Ellington has something to hide, claiming that the DAs in the past have always been cooperative in his other investigations. Remember, being a fire investigator, as he once was, is just like being a criminal investigator. So Bob thinks that if he can get all 3 convicted on board for new testing, it will convince Ellington to hand over everything so that he could take it to the MVAC people to test the evidence. In episode 1, he already got Jason's awkward approval, so now it's time to get consent from the other 2. Bob gives us a Damien Echols history lesson. He says Damien didn't know the victims and there was no physical evidence connecting him to the crime scene whatsoever. First of all, he didn't have to know the 3 boys to have done something cruel to them. Damien had a violent and threatening history, as I've mentioned in previous episodes. There's also evidence he stalked these kids, and he did in fact, despite what Damien claimed later, knew the crime scene. He lived at the Mayfair Apartments at one point and even wrote about it in one of his books. As for evidence, you're dealing with a crime scene that's outside and water washed away definitive evidence with areas also slicked off. There was evidence, but that evidence ultimately wasn't conclusive. This was a circumstantial case. Bob goes on to say Damien was the focus of the police investigation because he identified as a non-Christian, didn't like authority, and was already disliked by law enforcement. Okay, what Bob doesn't tell you is that maybe there was a reason for that dislike. Damien threatened police officers and his ex-girlfriend's father in a confrontation, Did that one slip Bob's mind? I mean, are we just going to gloss over it and minimize it because, we know Damien and anything he explains, he never does that, right? Clearly, everything that comes out of that little turd's mouth is gospel. Anyway, Bob goes on to say that as soon as the children's bodies were discovered, Damien became law enforcement's one and only suspect. Again, what Bob doesn't tell you is that law enforcement checked truckers' logs at the Blue Beacon, looked into registered sex offenders. Anyone remember when early in the investigation, the West Memphis Police Department briefly regarded two West Memphis teenagers as suspects, that being Chris Morgan and Brian Holland? They abruptly departed for Oceanside, California, 4 days after the bodies were discovered. Does that sound like Damien was the one and only suspect or even person of interest? Did the West Memphis Police Department not follow up and contacted law enforcement in California so they can question those kids? In fact, it was a pretty intense interrogation. Anyway, Bob contacts Damien and asks him questions like what life was like, after prison. And honestly, I don't feel like going into that. It's all filler. I don't care. Bob tells Damien about MVAC, and Damien is all for it. So Bob now has his consent, and let's move on. So Bob's next mission is to find Waldo, aka Jesse Miss Kelly, so that he can get his consent to test the evidence with MVAC. According to Bob, Jesse doesn't have a phone, email, or a permanent address, so Jesse has worked pretty hard to stay away from the media and the spotlight. But don't you worry, Bob will avoid someone's personal space just so he can get their consent. Before Bob can find him, he goes into why the West Memphis 3 case made no sense. He claimed all the boys had alibis, which isn't true. And I've discussed this in previous episodes. Jesse's alibis never held up, and they were debunked, as was Damien's. Jason's alibis were so bad that his defense attorney refused to even try to make one up for him. Bob talks about lack of evidence connecting the three to the crime scene, which I already went over. I don't want to be redundant. Bob also forgets that circumstantial evidence is often used to convict people. Let's get into that a little bit. There are times police do not have any physical evidence connecting the defendant or defendants to the crime, so they rely on evidence such as witness testimony and circumstantial clues to argue that the defendant or defendants is guilty. In order to find an accused person guilty in a circumstantial evidence case, the judge or jury must be satisfied beyond a reasonable doubt that the only rational inference that can be drawn from circumstantial evidence is that the accused is guilty. Circumstantial evidence is not to be evaluated piece by piece during the criminal trial, but rather on the totality. 24 jurors in the two different trials felt the state met the burden of proof beyond reasonable doubt. But that's not good enough for Bob. He's smarter. He's smarter than those other 24 people that heard the evidence. They're dumb. They were misled. They don't know what they're doing. Anyways, I digress. Bob then states that Jesse's confession was the only thing connecting the West Memphis 3 to the crime scene, which isn't true. I mean, technically Jesse's confession was the initial spark to tie it all together. But then after that, we start getting other things, such as Michael Carson's testimony regarding Jason confessing to him, Damien bragging about it at a park, the Hollingsworth clan spotting Damien near the crime scene, either with Jason or Dominique, depending on how you want to interpret that. And that's just to name a few. Like I already said, Jason's confession was the initial spark in putting it all together, but saying it was the only thing, in my opinion, is both ignorant and disingenuous. This, of course, leads Bob to get into Jesse's confession. Bob basically goes over the same crap already discussed in the Paradise Lost series. So Bob gets one of his experts, Jim Trainum, retired DC homicide detective, to tell him exactly what he wants to hear and that it was a forced confession. Because, murderers, they never initially deny that they murdered someone. They offer that shit up right away, right? I mean, once they do, never do they lie about the details to minimize their actions. Surely they never recant later on. I mean, we're talking about honest killers here. They would never lie. I mean, they'll kill, but they won't lie. No way. Anyone remember Chris Watts giving different confessions about how and why he murdered his wife, Shannon Watts, and his daughters? Chris claimed that he killed Shannon after she killed their daughters. Later, however, he confessed to killing, you know, his wife and daughters, and now Chris is saying that he was framed for the murders and he wasn't even home when it happened. Anyway, Jim Trainum gives his opinion, but keep in mind that's what it is. He's taking one piece of many confessions and making an opinion on incomplete information. Not everyone agrees with Trainum about false confessions. Even Lou Hennessy, a district court judge in Charles County, Maryland, disagrees. To this day, Hennessy has doubts about Trainum's account of how cops get false confessions. And hey, Hennessy isn't an enemy of Trainum. Hennessy believes Trainum is a good investigator and friend. Bob then goes into the Mr. Bojangles theory. In short, on the night of the murders, an African-American man walked into the Mr. Bojangles restaurant. A mother and daughter told the manager, Marty King, that someone was in the women's bathroom and wouldn't leave. The manager went into the bathroom and found the African-American man disarrayed, dirty with mud on his feet, and was bloody. He also had a blue Velcro cast on his arm. Marty called the police, but the man left before the police showed up. So from the crime scene, the bayou leads directly to the Mr. Bojangles restaurant. So the theory is that Mr. Bojangles used the bayou to distance himself and conceal himself from anyone spotting him. Of course, this thought is absurd. I mean, let's think this out loud, shall we? So this guy commits the crime against 3 boys, basically one-handed. He hog-ties them, cleans the evidence, puts the boys in the water ditch, puts their clothes and uses sticks so that it doesn't escape. He conceals himself until he gets to the restaurant, and then all of a sudden decides to show himself bloody and muddy. I mean, the logic doesn't make any sense. So Bob conducts another one of his dumbass experiments by getting Jeff, last name not known, who is a former Special Forces operator, to make the trek from the crime scene to the Mr. Bojangles restaurant, or what used to be known as the Mr. Bojangles restaurant. Jeff has 45 minutes or less to get there. Turned out it only took a highly trained Special Forces operator around 17 minutes, which I guess proves that a Special Forces operator could make it from the crime scene to the restaurant. Okay. The Special Forces officer, he offers what I think are my same thoughts on how it doesn't make any sense to conceal yourself from the bayou just to go into a populated area. Bob agrees with that too. So this silly experiment was, again, another wasteful filler. Bob concludes what we already know, and that Mr. Bojangles is not a viable suspect. Thank God we had Bob to figure that out, or else we never would have got to that conclusion. As Bob continues to locate Jesse, he meets with Jim Clemente again so Jim can share his victimology profile with Bob. So what does Jim have for us? Well, we got 3 8-year-old boys. It's a small and relatively safe town. The boys are unsupervised. They're low-risk victims, and they're in a low-risk environment. The offender had to at some point approach the victims. Approach is important because there's 3 boys, and there's nothing forensically that more than one person was involved. Now, let me go ahead and break right there. The victims were tied with 3 distinct knots. This pointed to 3 killers involved in the murders. So just wanted to say that, so let's move on. What happened there was consistent throughout. The consistency shows a singular offender and not multiple. Again, I call bullshit on that. One offender was able to control 3 boys without any help. Couldn't have been a stranger who looked threatening because the reaction would be for the boys to run away. Hence, this was an offender that the boys knew. Behavioral indicators point to who was either a biological relative or a family member or a community member, someone they thought they could trust. If boys thought that they were doing something wrong, like staying out late, drinking, smoking, etc., it would be easier to control them because the kids would feel they deserve punishment. But the punishment goes too far. Gender role based on concealment is a masculine thing. Also, the level of violence. One or two boys incapacitated because the way the boys were tied would give them some chance to move and possibly get away. So, the way they were tied was more of a practical way to conceal versus a restraining method. Offender would have to have some knowledge as a butcher or hunter because it wasn't a planned event. It was someone who got enraged, took it too far, and having to clean up the mess. Offender got rid of the bikes due to known relationship, spent more time concealing crime than the actual murders. Offender, biological or family member, over-disciplined one of the boys. It went too far, so he had to kill the other two. Age was a factor. Younger people are more impulsive, but older people can collect themselves under extreme pressure. Person would have a long-term job or relationship, possibly in his 30s. Offender is prone to violent outbursts. History of domestic violence. I think most of you can see where this is going, right? Which family members have been accused of this before? Who is the latest to be accused? More on that part later, but I'd like to point out that criminal profiler Pat Brown also profiled this case and had a completely different opinion. In her research on the case, this is what she has to say about the crime. The crimes were committed by more than one person. The offenders lived nearby the crime scene. The boys were targeted because they were easy to access and control. The boys were probably followed and conned or lured into the woods. The boys were overpowered by larger assailants, and the crime was committed at the scene, most likely in the water during the waning daylight hours. The crime was planned, but not in the sense that it would necessarily end with homicide. Like wildling, crimes involving groups of young teens often end extremely violently. Nothing but a knife or two was brought with the offenders, nor was anything but weapons taken away. This shows lack of maturity or criminal experience. The offenders did not attempt to get rid of the evidence. The water was a lucky break. The crime was violent and was a show of power. Essentially, it was a thrill kill. I'll link both a blog entry and YouTube video where Pat goes into this in more depth, but I wanted to show that Jim's profile is disputed. Bob finally tracks down Jesse at someone's trailer. Someone answers the door and lets Bob in. As he enters, the person who let him in also tells Jesse that Bob the investigator is here to see him. Jesse is not interested. It's alleged that Jesse had a bad toothache. I don't know if that's true or not, but I guess it doesn't really matter. However, Bob doesn't let someone's personal wishes get in the way of getting what he wants. Bob, imposing his will, asks Jesse if he can get his consent to do new DNA testing on the evidence. Jesse says that's fine, and so Bob now has consent from all three of the convicted. Such a wonderful television moment. Bob is excited. So Bob tries to reach out to Scott Ellington so that he can have Scott just hand over the evidence to him to be tested. Scott nor any of his representatives responded back, and now Bob is mad. How dare a state prosecutor just not hand over evidence to be tested, because clearly in the past, never has the side of the defendant skewed details of results. No bias whatsoever. I mean, it's like Bob has never taken a position, right? Bob has no dog in the fight. Complete neutrality here. I mean, he's only falsely assumed that this case wasn't solved. He's using the flawed premise that it hasn't because it's now on the shoulders of him, Big Bad Bob, and in a hubris tone, he says he will not allow Scott Ellington to get in the way of finding the truth. I mean, we're dealing with the last outlaw here. Does he think he's Batman? You know, some vigilante detective who's going to solve the case because the system is corrupt and only he can save everybody. I don't know why, but for some reason, when he walks in slow-mo in some of these scenes, I'm just playing in the back of my head Bon Jovi's Wanted, Dead or Alive, and I can't help but laugh. But anyways, the show now goes into persons of interest. Bob limits the criteria of how this case can be solved. It appears that he's throwing away circumstantial evidence, and the only method that must be used now is forensics and science. Bob goes into 2007 when the West Memphis 3 defense team obtained some of the evidence for testing in their appeal. Bob states that none of their DNA, meaning the West Memphis 3's DNA, was found at the crime scene, but he also leaves out that mostly everything tested had contamination and was inconclusive. Bob assumes that the scales of justice were tipping on the side of the West Memphis 3, but stated that the appeals would take years to complete and that the state had to do something to preserve their conviction, so both the state and the defense compromised on the Alford plea. Now let's hold up. The West Memphis 3 had an evidentiary hearing in December of 2011. If the evidence that Bob claimed was the tipping point, that it was so strong, you would assume it would have granted them a new trial, and that never happened. Instead, the defense approached the state, not the other way around. Bob acts like this is a moot point, but it's not. The state was willing to see this through. They didn't go to the defense and ask them for a compromise. The amount of years served plus the compromise to preserve the conviction while the defendants get to maintain their innocence and walk free was a win for both sides. But it wasn't a win for the families, the victims' families. Not for Stevie Branch Sr., not for Terry Hobbs, and not for Todd and Dana Moore. They were very much against this and would have rather it just went to a new trial. So let's keep that in mind. Again, like I said before, we have no idea how Melissa Byers would have felt. She long passed before that. But my understanding is that she did go to her grave believing that the West Memphis 3 killed her son. So Ellington, he's new in this position, right? And he took the path of least resistance. I'd be very, very curious to see what Brent Davis would have done in this situation. If anyone has access to him, like approachable access, and unless it's already been stated how he would have done it or how he would have felt, I'd be very curious. But I really don't know how he would have. But I think it would have been different. But I don't know. I'm just speculating. Bob brings up the 2 hairs found on and near the crime scene that may have, according to Bob, connected 2 new suspects to the murders. That being Terry Hobbs, stepfather of Stevie Branch, and his friend David Jacoby. Why? Because the hairs couldn't exclude them. However, as mentioned before, Thomas Fedor, forensic serologist hired by the West Memphis 3 defense team, stated, the 2 hairs that I know about, the one that could have in fact come from Mr. Hobbs and the one that could have in fact come from David Jacoby, constitute what I call weak evidence. Because there are other people it could have come from and there isn't any way to really prove our selection of possible sources for that hair. I don't think, my personal opinion, I don't think that the hair evidence would be enough to convict Mr. Hobbs or Mr. Jacoby or anyone that could be in that similar situation because it's simply not strong enough. Still, that didn't stop the spin and narrative steering to point away from the West Memphis 3 and to point towards Terry Hobbs and to a certain degree David Jacoby. And this also didn't stop Natalie Maines from the Chicks, or formerly known as the Dixie Chicks, to point the finger at Terry Hobbs. So Bob wants to interview Terry Hobbs and David Jacoby because of the DNA evidence discovered in 2007. Before he does that, Bob yet again talks to another one of his DNA experts, Susanna Ryan of Pure Gold Forensics, to give him the narrative that he wants. Bob claimed all he read about of the 2007 DNA testing was from the media, and he needs it explained to him. Funny how he didn't just read what Fedor said, maybe because Bob didn't like the word weak evidence. So Bob goes into how the West Memphis 3's previous investigation was aimed to exonerate the West Memphis 3, so that's how David Jacoby gets wrapped up in the story. So because one of the hairs found at the crime scene couldn't exclude Jacoby, it made him an alternate suspect for the defense. Because of this, the court of public opinion made Jacoby a child murderer. So Bob sits down and interviews Jacoby. He asks him things like his friendship with Terry and his recollections of the night Michael, Stevie, and Christopher went missing. Jacoby comes off high-strung, anxious, and emotional. Always seems like he's about to go into a breakdown, and you can always hear that he's about to cry. Bob, he's asking Jacoby for the perfect timeline, something that would seem impossible to do with memories fading or becoming selective. Even Jacoby's worried about getting details wrong. Still, Bob assumes it is likely that Jacoby couldn't have been with Terry between the hours of 6:30 p.m. and 8 p.m. Since there's been issues between what Terry remembers and what Jacoby remembers, and it seems to be used against one and not the other, let's get into that a bit. The website How Stuff Works published an article called 10 Ways Your Memory is Completely Inaccurate. It's written by Melanie McManus. I'd like to share a bit of her insight. So she writes, while many of us think our memories as movies we simply replay in our heads, they're actually nothing like that. They're fuzzy, blurry snapshots of the past that our brains constantly tinker with. Our brain might incorporate things from the present into an old memory, for example, or fill in any gaps in our recollections with snippets of other memories. And all of our memories are sifted through our own personal filters and biases, which is why several people can observe the same incident and have different takes on what occurred. To look at it another way, our recollections are stories we remember about ourselves that contain some truths, but also details based on general truths about our lives. So it isn't abnormal that Jacoby might remember details differently than how Terry remembers them. It's not suspect because Terry gets a few details wrong well after a decade. There's no smoking gun in that. There's no gotcha moment. Memories fade and are flawed. And we are all subject to it. No one is exempt. Having said all of that, Bob feels that Jacoby isn't responsible for the murders. And again, thank Damien's moon water goddess, we have the mighty sleuth to rule him out. What would we do without him? We would all be lost without his sage investigation and wisdom. Bob reached out to Terry Hobbs prior to the docuseries, and Terry agreed to sit down and talk to Bob off the record. After that conversation, Terry declined to be interviewed for the show. Bob has his version of the story, and Terry has his side, and Terry has talked about this in other podcasts. Keep in mind, many have done a hatchet job on Terry. It's happened before, and so the skepticism is clearly justified. But Bob needs answers to some pretty big questions, and he feels entitled that he gets it. How dare anyone turn Bob down? Clearly, there's something to hide if someone declines talking to Big Bad Bob. So Bob wants to get to know Terry better during the time that these murders happened. And what a better way than asking someone who has a bias towards him. So Bob goes back to the well and talks to Jolyn Hicks. Jolyn explained that his nephew Stevie was usually a happy kid except for one thing. Daddy Terry. So the narrative begins. Terry was an angry stepfather who just liked to whoop Stevie over the most arbitrary things because he was jealous of him. Jolyn, she Monday morning quarterbacks by asking why didn't the police question Terry, but I'd also like to ask if Terry was so abusive towards Stevie, why didn't Jolyn or any other family member bring up the alleged abuse to law enforcement? Why didn't they bring up the abuse towards Stevie even before that to law enforcement? Instead, about a year after the murders, Pam's father, Jackie Hicks Sr., went on the Geraldo show to talk about the crime. So Bob meets up with Jim Clemente again to go over the list of suspects to see who fits the offender description. So they rule out Todd Moore, Michael's father. He was a truck driver and was out of state at the time. They then rule out John Mark Byers, Christopher's adoptive father, despite fitting Jim's profile. Then there's Terry Hobbs, stepfather of Stevie, who Jim asked if Terry had any hunting or butchering experience. Bob said that he didn't have a hunting background, but he used to work at a slaughterhouse. Jim said it fit the profile. Jim asked if the police did a formal interview, in which Bob replied that they didn't until 2007. Bob also brings up Terry's civil suit against Natalie Maines, where Terry was brought in for a deposition that lasted a couple of days. So Bob shows Jim some of the interview from the deposition to see what Jim thinks. Natalie Maines' attorney brings up statements from Pam's mom, Marie Hicks, and Pam's sister, Jolyn. Essentially, the statements accused Terry of being an abusive stepfather towards Stevie. The attorney asked Terry if any of those statements were true, and Terry declared that they were not. Jim acts surprised, taking accusations and conjecture as some sort of eureka moment. Jim, let's be honest, custom profile, in his opinion, matches Terry. So they watch more video from the deposition, this time a statement by Pam, Terry's ex-wife, with the claim that Terry hit her with a closed fist. Terry stated that it wasn't a true statement. The attorney asked what was true about it. Terry said that he backhanded Pam after she kept, needling and provoking him for 3 days over an accusation of seeing another woman. So Jim declares another data point in the profile, alleged abuse of Stevie and an admitted backhand slap to Pam's face. Bob plays more video for Jim, this time regarding when Terry called the police to report Stevie missing. He called when he picked up Pam from work, which was Catfish Island, at around 9:11 p.m. Terry actually didn't recall if he was the one who called or if it was Pam. Police came out to Pam's place of employment and the police took down their report. So Jim said that Terry said something that really struck a chord with him. The police were called at Catfish Island, so Jim makes the assumption that Terry didn't want the police to go to the house. And so by his logic, it would have been better to drive 5 minutes back to the house to see if Stevie was there. Again, that just sounds like we're looking at things from hindsight. It could also be determined that, hey, Pam wanted Terry or whoever to call right away, and so they called and they used the payphone. I mean, I don't think that's out of the realm of possibility. But anyways, Bob acts like this is some sort of epiphany. More assumptions are made by Bob that Terry could have went home to clean up and wouldn't want the police there, which makes no sense. So he doesn't want the cops to suspect anything, but his wife wouldn't. You don't think his wife wouldn't ask about anything being muddy or why was the washer or dryer on? I don't know. That's just something I'm thinking of. Now Bob is boiling with anger. The incredible Bob is angry, and you wouldn't like him if he was angry.
I'm mad!
Then his voice starts to break as he's so emotional because his desire for truth and justice is unrivaled by any other investigator who ever worked the case. Bob declares that this is something new that he never caught on to before, and thank Damien's Moonwater Goddess that it was caught on film. What an incredible coincidence. Bob is so mad that he doesn't want to see the video with Terry on it because, that righteous anger is pulsing through his veins. What would Bob do if Terry was there? Perhaps serve him up some good old-fashioned truth and justice fisticuffs? I mean, give me a break with this macho bullshit. To me personally, this whole scene, it just seems scripted to me. And poorly at that. But if you ever watched it, I mean, you can draw your own conclusions. Again, maybe the perspective would be different. The scene ends with Jim stating Terry fits the profile cleanly, but it doesn't mean that he did the crime, so they need to find a way to rule him out. Never mind that the police never considered him a suspect, but regardless, and basically that means that he was cleared just on that alone. But Bob, he agrees but says it can only be done with science and DNA testing, which brings us back to Scott Ellington. So Bob tried calling Terry again with no response. There was some awkward back and forth conversations from the producers out of view. One of them asked Bob if he thinks Terry did it. Bob said it would be overstating as an investigator to determine whether he believed Terry did it or not, but he does think he's a good suspect, and the only way to know for sure is to test the evidence. Bob reaches out to Damien to let him know where he's at in the investigation, and the crux of the conversation was not being able to get a hold of Scott Ellington and how the state of Arkansas doesn't want to find out the truth. Bob declares he will never stop and he will never go away until he finds that truth. Bob calls Pam Hicks to explain the situation, and she believes it's just a big old conspiracy within the state of Arkansas. In conclusion, Bob was never able to reach Scott Ellington or obtain the evidence to test. He tells the audience that they should be furious that Ellington is hiding from the truth and that they should send letters and call his office demanding the truth. He dares Ellington to look in Pam's eyes and tell her that she doesn't deserve to know who killed her son. Bob then gets out of his chair, and he does it in this awkward walk around and leaves the view of camera. I suppose this was supposed to be a heroic walk-off moment, but it just looked silly. This sham of a docuseries finally ends with an embarrassing whimper. So let's highlight what happened after the docuseries leading up to the June 23rd hearing. I'm going to reference Lisa O'Brien's case notes and quote them when needed. I will also link her notes in the description below because she goes into more details and it is well worth a read. Despite the fact that Bob Ruff lacked standing to investigate the case or direct testing of evidence, he expected Ellington to permit testing and facilitate transfer of all case evidence to a lab of Ruff's choosing. While Ruff recorded interviews with Echols and Baldwin and obtained their consent to his testing requests, he failed to file any form of official request in the state courts in Arkansas to obtain judicial approval of his request. Essentially, a motion would have to be filed to have the evidence tested. In 2020, Ellington was elected to the bench and left the prosecutor's office. The Arkansas governor appointed Keith Crestman to serve as Ellington's replacement. Crestman reiterated that in order to test the evidence, it would need to be requested in a court and approved by the court. Crestman also explained that the property is seized and that it doesn't belong to his office, so they would need to petition the court asking permission, also giving the state an opportunity to be heard as well. Then there was an issue where Crestman thought that the evidence was gone and burned in a fire in 2011. According to an article published by the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, the West Memphis mayor allegedly confirmed that case evidence was destroyed in a fire 15 years ago. WMC 5 Action News reported that evidence was transferred to a shipping container and a fire destroyed evidence in the shipping container. Of course, all hell broke loose in the court of public opinion, but it turned out that the evidence was fine and well cataloged. Eventually, a court hearing was set for June 23, 2022. Bob would cheerlead for the West Memphis 3, even making horrifically designed t-shirts declaring "Test the fucking evidence," with the West Memphis 3 acronym covering up most of the statement. Bob, along with supporters, would go to the courthouse, also hoping to be in the room for the hearing. Unintentional funny things happened, like supporters going to the wrong courthouse or Bob and others not allowed inside due to COVID-19 measures. This would make Bob and supporters mad, but ironically enough, Bob got COVID while visiting. Hard to say if he got it while on his way or in the parking lot of the courthouse or asking people to join him later for drinks later that night on Twitter. Jason Baldwin would also show up at the courthouse, but the night before, Jason wrote something on Twitter that was very revealing. He expressed disappointment that Damien and his attorneys didn't consult him or his attorneys regarding the petition for testing with MVAC. Jason would go on to state that it would have been good to discuss his concerns over testing and whether or not it was the best technology moving forward. So, what happened in the hearing? Well, Damien Echols' request to retest evidence was denied. Judge Tanya Alexander ruled that under the current state habeas corpus laws, Echols is not eligible to retest evidence because he is no longer a prisoner in state custody. Patrick Benka, who represented Echols, argued that Echols cannot be truly free until evidence is retested and Echols is exonerated. Judge Alexander pointed out that Echols missed his chance at exoneration in 2011. You had an opportunity to request a new trial. Instead, you chose an Alford plea, Judge Alexander explained. Judge Alexander advised Echols and his attorneys that if they wanted to pursue further testing, the avenue they should take is to talk to state legislators about changing the habeas corpus laws to allow freed convicted felons to continue retest evidence to seek exoneration and to clear their names. I don't follow public opinion or emotions. I follow the law, Judge Alexander said. Okay, let's get into Bob's Truth and Justice podcast from last Friday. Like I said in my last episode, I don't have the time nor the will to obsessively listen to every one of Bob's episodes and criticize them like some people do. I have listened to maybe only 5 episodes. One was a 2-part episode because I wanted to listen to Lisa O'Brien debate Bob on the West Memphis 3 case, which in my opinion, she wiped the floor with him. I listened to the Dawn Moore episode, which after listening I regretted because in my opinion it was sick and exploitive. I feel bad for Todd and Dana that had to happen. I don't think they deserve that. Just another opportunity for clicks. I also listened to his court hearing explained and his Friday follow-up, in which I'm about to get into. In the July 1st episode, Bob and his shit-sipping co-host did exactly what I predicted. They cried injustice. They were just stunned, even though they were warned that this was likely going to be the outcome. But it wasn't the decision that surprised Bob. He falsely claims that they tricked him. They, I'm assuming the state of Arkansas and the judge. I don't know. But I guess they, the system, I suppose. Bob said he felt stupid. He felt like an idiot for not seeing this. Well, let me help you out, Bob. The epiphany of feeling stupid, or rather being stupid, shouldn't have began on June 23rd. That's how you should have felt from the very beginning of getting involved in this case. During a lunch, Bob interpreted a statement from Benka that the only path to victory is by tearing down the system. Ooh, how so rage against the machine of Bobby. Bob said he's so sick of nons, which, for those who don't know, are people who believe in the West Memphis Three's guilt, that believe this was a publicity stunt. I mean, the idea is not entirely baseless. Damien, along with his wife, had a book published in April of this year. To generate sales, you need press. Ain't nothing like a good old court hearing to bring back the memories of that perceived wrongfully convicted guy, and woe is that tragic hero who is still being wronged by the system as he just soldiers on. If this was about justice, why was Jason confused he wasn't consulted? What about his due process, or Jesse's? They weren't consulted because this was about Damien. But hey, Bob now says that there's some money rolling in, or will soon roll in, and by listeners and by some big pockets, people of influence. And it's going to take years. How about that? Money. This little stunt's going to generate some money. I guarantee it. He then calls people like me and people who believe in the West Memphis Three's guilt pieces of shit by claiming that we don't want the DNA tested. This is the part where I address Bob now. First off, idiot, I recall seeing nons, including myself, stating that we aren't afraid of testing. We agree, test everything, ligatures, clothing, sticks, etc., you name it. But we both knew it wasn't going to happen based off the state statutes. So to say that we are afraid is it's just a bunch of pile of bullshit, because you think you're allowed exemption to do whatever the fuck you want. For some reason, that is unknown to you. I don't get it. You seem like you have this major comprehension issue with it. You also claimed that we remained silent until after the hearing. Another fucking lie. You came on my tweet on May 10th and dueled with me on this issue. I said it most likely wasn't going to go your way, and I was right and you were wrong. I also wasn't the only one, so you can stop acting like we're cowards, because I assure you no one is scared of you or the truth. The truth was established in court in 1994 by 2 sets of juries. Like it or not, learn to love it, because that's what happened. Then you have the nerve to tell us to go fuck ourselves, you salty bastard. No, Bob, you go fuck yourself. Calling us low IQ? You mean like Jesse Miskelly? Then you say we'll talk about how mean you are. Ooh, dude, be happy, be mean, be sad. But I am not the one over here spewing sour grapes because you had the delusion you were going to be a part of changing history, to help lead some kind of movement. Well, Bob, to steal a quote from Ash Williams from Army of Darkness, I got news for you, pal. You ain't leading but 2 things right now: Jack and shit, and Jack left town. You call people like me a waste of space. I think you take up too much space. You're a smug and arrogant prick who uses stupid little phrases like "test the evidence" and "scared of the truth." No, you couldn't see the truth if it kicked you right in the pie eater. And that's all I hope I have to say about you. Like others, I can't make it a daily routine. I don't need to join some anti-Bob fan club. I know enough about you, and I addressed it, and that's good enough for me. People can love what I have to say, or they can hate what I have to say. Until next time.
Ain't no motherfucker in this world could do it like me. Open up your eyes and insert a little rising. You don't have to love me, you don't have to like me.